Hello. In this episode of Aswatona podcast, you will get to meet Julia Neumann. Based in Beirut, she is a podcaster from Germany. Julia tells us how she uses podcasting as a mean for anti-racist work. Let's meet her.
Hello, I'm Julia. I'm a journalist for print and radio and a podcaster from Germany, and I'm currently based in Beirut, Lebanon. I love everything storytelling. I love being creative. I love patterns. I love music. I love colors. So, podcasting is really creating those images in your head with sound, which I really love to do. I studied journalism, but I didn't really have much to say on my own and myself. And studying journalism, we learn that you are neutral, you are just viewing, you are reporting on what other people do, but we didn't learn so much about our own upbringing and how that influences our work or the stories that we tell. So when I was in Morocco and I studied there for a year, I learned a lot about post-colonial perspectives and about my Eurocentric perspectives on politics. And that really opened my eyes and really also had an influence in understanding how we are socialized makes an impact on the stories that we're telling. So I think kind of like being self-reflective and critical about Eurocentric perspectives and my own upbringing as a European, that makes a difference in the stories I tell, to be more empathetic and also to have a better, let's say, view or perspective or understanding of intersectionality about how different realities shape people's stories. Coming from Germany, I know the audience that I'm catering to. So I know the audience of the podcast production. So most of the listeners are German. And as I'm based in Beirut and I'm mostly podcasting on stories from the Vanna region, I feel like knowing that Germans often have a very basic understanding of a region that is often homogenized and also that is often viewed from a very colonial or, let's say, Orientalist perspectives, and that is often in the news because of conflicts, then that makes a difference in really getting the stories that are important to tell in order to tackle those stereotypes, to tackle racism, and also to diversify or complexify the narrative. To me, it feels like everyone in Germany has a podcast, so podcasting is really popular. There's wannabe prominent people, there's actual prominent figures, activists, newspapers, coaches, influencers. There's political foundations, organizations, there's companies, and there's even health insurances who have a podcast. So the field is huge and it's extremely professionalized in Germany. There's even podcasts about the podcasting scene, and there's a very famous German podcasting prize. So it's big business in here. And what started as underground and niche, that really became big productions as in Netflix way of storytelling, but in audio. So I think the challenge is there. Like, it's so professionalized, and there's a huge pressure in having good audio quality, especially with German broadcasters and professional radio shows going into the podcast scene that really put pressure on those like underground or single producers who are doing everything on their own to have like studio-like quality. And also that put pressure on the way we narrate stories, the storytelling, not only the audio quality, but also post-production, the way that we mix the audio, music, and sounds play a huge role in storytelling. And then on the other hand, because everyone has a podcast, it's really, really hard to gain listeners, and you need to have a lot of patience and do a lot of marketing to get it out there. So the professionalization of the market, in my view, also brought a lot of very well-produced podcasts from traditional media who kind of like used podcasting as a way to tell stories, to tell investigations. So we have high-quality podcasts on investigations about tax fraud, about political crimes, also about major events or tragedies that happened in Germany, such as podcasts investigating the racist attacks in Hanau or sexual assaults that happened, unfortunately, during New Year's in Cologne 2015. So we have those like more, let's say, journalistic investigations, where journalists spoke to a lot of people, did interviews, have a lot of material, gathered a lot of material, did a lot of research, and then they're narrating those stories and they're narrating the research. But then we also have very successful podcasts that have a total different approach, that come more from this like talking or interviewing style of podcasts. So for example, two people who had a radio show, they moved to Spotify. And I mean, Spotify is a giant in the podcast business. I'm talking about Jan Böhmermann and Olli Schulz, a satirist and a singer-songwriter, and they are having a talking podcast, Fest and Flauschig, which is super successful. And then there's another super successful podcast also on Spotify, which is called Gemischtes Hack, which means basically mixed minced meat. And it's basically two comedians talking. So for me, that's still incredible, like how podcasts of two men talking about very basic, even abstruse, banal things, such as like their daily life, are having such an immense amount of followers, of fans, and attract a massive amount of people. And another huge opportunity for content creators in Germany is the diversity of the topics that can be discussed, also because of the popularity of the medium. So from political updates or debates, from gaining knowledge from scientists, but also about relationships or sexuality, and even topics around psychology are discussed in podcasts. So in my view, podcasts really help to tackle the taboo in Germany of mental health issues or illnesses. I think that really shows that there is a need for knowledge, and that podcast is also kind of feeling like you're sitting next to someone who's talking about their daily lives, but also something where you can gain knowledge or new perspectives from. Some of my favorite podcasts are actually journalistic formats in itself, because I'm a journalist and I love very well told and recorded stories that also have a huge of background research. So, for example, there's one podcast by the newspaper Süddeutsche. They produced a podcast series about a very well-known feminist in Germany, Alice Schwarzer, and she became a really critical figure because of racist comments and because she evaded taxes. So, in order to know more, the podcast really gave me a lot of perspectives on her as a person, but also in a very critical way, talking to people who know her and talking to Alice Schwarzer herself. What I observed about German podcasts is that Germans really seem to like inspiring and profound conversations. So, for example, in the book scene, non-fiction books, so-called Sachbücher, for example, on the body, on psychology, they are really a big hit in Germany, and so is it in podcasts. So yeah, everything that is, non-fiction and where people gain knowledge, like, seems to be super interesting for Germans. And I think that's an interesting observation. We're not so much into fantasy or literature podcasts, but more into like intellectualizing and maybe politicizing also debates. I don't know if that's true, but it's just from my observation of not only the book market, but also the podcast market in Germany, and how that is like feeding into the interests of the people here. I also still don't get in my head, because I come from a journalistic background, how podcasts in which people are just talking for like not 1 hour, but for like 3 or 4 hours are still successful in Germany. So there's a podcast which is called Alles Gesagt, which basically is a podcast in which the interviewee decides when the interview is over. So they're talking for like 3 or 4 hours, and people are actually listening to it. It became such a hit.